Now, if you're like me, you just recently watched and was incredibly inspired by Dune. I went back and listened to both soundtracks and rewatched part 1. And I just saw part 2 in IMAX in the theater and have been thinking about it ever since. Now, I highly recommend you seeing it on the big screen. It was the details, the cinematography, the music, the whole entire experience was amazing. And so I recently made a video on lomography Redscale film shot at night. And while I made that video, I tried to make a Redscale recipe for my Fujifilm X-H2S as well as my X-T5 for the video. Well, since then I've refined and tweaked it a bit and I'm ready to share my results. Now first I'm going to share some of my favorite photos from daylight, and then I'll share some night photos with the recipe. Then I'm going to share my recipe settings and show you how I got there. The recipe is a good base, but certain scenes and lighting scenarios call for slightly different adjustments that I'll walk through. And in that walkthrough, I'll look at it from Fuji X RAW Studio and how I refine those Fujifilm recipes. One of the first things to consider is how this recipe handles on those bright, sunny days where the sun is very high overhead. And you'll notice that the color of the water almost turns obsidian. I also really enjoy the gradient in the sky and how it is barely blue. But I think where I really enjoyed this recipe the most was during golden hour. The way it plays with light and darkness and all the gradients during golden hour makes it feel like it's almost like a black and white film, but really accentuating that golden hue. On overcast days, it takes on a completely different characteristic. On sunny days, I usually dial down the color saturation, but on these overcast days, I actually had to dial it back up. At night, this film simulation comes alive with all the different reds, oranges, and yellows. Adding a Pro Mist or Cine Bloom filter adds more mystique to the scene. I especially like this shot with the moon looking blood orange reflected in the lake and the lights off to the left. For this scene, I like the yellow street light as well as the smoke coming from the exhaust. For these next couple of shots, I want you to pay attention especially to the window lights and how they all turn into this piercing yellow. That's one of my favorite things about this film recipe. Now I'm going to share all the settings that I use for this Dune Redscale Fujifilm recipe. So here are the Dune Redscale Fujifilm recipe settings. First of all, this is made for the X-Trans V sensor. I've tested it on the X-H2S as well as the X-T5, but it should work on the X-H2, the X-S20, and the X100 VI. Potentially can work on other models as well, but I haven't tested it. So for your settings, first you'll want to do the film simulation Eterna. The next thing I chose was the grain effect at strong and large. The next setting is I did the color chrome effect at weak. And then for the color chrome effect for blue, I have that turned off. Now this is one of the most important pieces. The next piece you'll want to do is white balance. Set it to custom and have it at 10,000 Kelvin. So you want to do the white balance shift and you want to put that all the way at +9 for red and -9 for blue. I usually put DR at auto. You could also put this at 400 or depending whatever your ISO is. Next is I usually put the highlight at +1. Next I put the shadow usually at +2, but sometimes I will put that up or down all the way up to +3, sometimes at +1. Kind of depends on the scene. For color, I usually keep this at -2, although on the overcast days, here's actually where I bumped it up to either 0 or +2 to help give a little more saturation in the scene. Sharpness I usually keep at -2, and then the other settings, high ISO noise reduction and clarity, I keep at 0. Now for video settings, you'll see that the ones underlined are the only ones that you can set. All the other settings are just for photo, but you should mostly get the same look and effect that you would in the photo mode. Alright, so now I'm going to open up, here's Fuji X RAW Studio, and I want to show a couple of photos and looking at how the scene normally looked and then adding my Fuji recipe and then making some adjustments here and there. So here you can see an Astia, and if I go down I have my Lomo Redscale or my Dune Redscale recipe, and here you can see how the sky renders and how if we go back to the image and then do like a side by side, you can see how they look side by side together. See how the sky goes from this blue to, you can almost feel like there's a light hint of blue, but I think that might just be the eyes playing tricks on you based on how it actually looks. Now I want to go to this shot. I really like how this turned out on Redscale. You can see the very blue sky in Astia, and this color water was definitely kind of darker. It's a muddier river, but I loved how it turned out on the Redscale. Here you can see it has this very like deep kind of blood brown almost type of look. But you can continue, like I'm going to go over here and actually see if we can play with other things. You know, one thing I mentioned is you can play around with the highlight and shadow tone if you really want those darks darker. You know, I keep playing around and seeing where do I actually want the shadows. You'll notice if you have it at -2, it really flattens out the image. But I think Redscale and kind of that Dune look really has deep shadows. The other thing sometimes I'll do is play with the push-pull. So putting it up a stop, putting it down a stop, to really see like what kind of lighting you want in the scene. So this is something I also make a lot of changes with sometimes. The other thing too, you could bring up the color or down the color, but I really think it looks better in like a subtly, like almost like a little bit desaturated look. Again, here's another scene. You can just really see how bright blue the sky is, and how here the water is a lot more blue in the original color. But again, if I go down to my recipe, it has like, I love what it does to the sky. The water becomes almost like this obsidian color or like this very deep color. Again, we can go and play around with exposure values if you want to make it like more moody. You can kind of play with those. Or again, a little bit of the shadow tone. You see how it really kind of flattens out the image a little bit more. It makes it not so stark. Here, especially at -2, it makes it very flat. And I think it loses a lot of what makes it Dune Redscale look versus, you know, once you really add those harsh blacks is really kind of what makes this kind of fun. I mean, you could even really push those darks all the way up like a +4 and maybe bring the light back in a little bit. Now you've made it even more like kind of harsh. But again, that's the fun in these recipes, is you can kind of keep playing around and seeing how they look. So I really liked this shot a lot. There's a lot of buildings in kind of the Twin Cities areas that have lots of glass, and they're just so great to photograph because of all the reflected skies and clouds and all that. So here's kind of the original, and here is the Redscale look. Again, I love the sky so much and how it renders with this. But again, I'm going to play with some of the things that I like to play with. We can make it even darker. I kind of like that actually. So versus here's how, you know, even and flat it looks. I kind of like this like stark. It actually makes the windows look very interesting to me. But we can push and pull. We can bring some of the light back, or we can actually make it very moody and dark again. But I kind of liked it. I think this looks really cool. So in this instance, I probably would have kept the shadow tone up versus at the 2. to give it a little bit more contrast and dynamic element to the scene. So now I have a couple of indoor shots that I converted. I actually didn't shoot with my recipe, so that's one of the beauties of shooting RAW on the Fujifilm cameras, is you could actually go back and add and apply different recipes later on. So here you got this indoor scene. I think that looks really cool. Here's another example. Really like this shot with the different lights in the scene and the hallway and the pillars. But again, let's go back to how it normally looked. It has, like in the original shot, your eyes are kind of drawn, I think, to the color over here and the hallway a little bit, versus now with this, I feel like you're kind of drawn to the lights and down straight versus not as distracted on the right side. I liked this sign, this LOL sign, versus in the original Astia, you know, you have a lot more color variation, obviously. What I tried to do in the recipe is you really, like the red is still there, but adding some dark contrast. You have the shadow tone, probably bring up that even more if you want, or play around again with the EV, or bring down the EV. Actually, it looks kind of cool, a little bit darker, I think, maybe a third of a stop. So now we're going to look at a little bit of the overcast. I actually originally shot this in black and white when I was shooting, but you know, some of the things I did here, let me go back to the as shot condition. So here's the black and white look, and then when I go into Redscale, so this is my original recipe, and you can see I actually had it redder when I created this. And so here's an example where I might bring up the shadow tone more if I want. I also want to bring the color way up. Let's see, at +5. I think I actually did do it all the way up to +4 or 3, something like that. And then also bring down some of the exposure possibly. So here you can see kind of how it was more red. I think it definitely calls for more saturation on overcast days. So I'll give you another example here. And we can actually go back to Astia to kind of see how this is kind of how the scene looked versus I did shoot it in a black and white profile that day. And then when I add the red scale, my recipe, you can see that it's a lot lighter versus what I opted for when I was playing around with it. Is I wanted to, again, bring up the shadow a little bit more, maybe to a +3 here. Maybe bring down the exposure a little bit, especially in the sky. And then also bring up the color, maybe to like a +3. That might be a little too much actually for this shot. So +1, that's kind of how it looks like versus if I go back to my recipe, you can see it's a lot lighter. Here's an example. You can see I had the shadow tone at +4. The color I did bring up a little bit at just -1, but we could bring this up even more because the tree is a little bit lighter. I think I opted to not make it so saturated versus some of the other shots on this overcast day. I wanted it to be a bit more saturated. Here's a good example where you see that I took the color up to +2. Could even look at it at +4 because there's so little saturation here. It's hard to kind of pull out even more color, but you could even make this moodier by bringing the exposure down, really focusing on the clouds there, or you can go the opposite. And here's where you can kind of make the ground a little bit more the focus. So last, let's take a look at how the night scenes are. I'm just going to take us back to, this is how the scene normally looks. This is one of my favorite spots to photograph The Monte Carlo bar just has a beautiful neon sign with lots of reds, blues, and yellows. But I've done lots of different shots here too. I have my Cine Still, I have my Fujifilm T64 look. But today we're looking at this Redscale look. Now, one of the things you notice with this recipe right now is I feel like it's really kind of bright up here in the red lights. So a couple of things I'd probably do right away is one, I probably want to add more shadow tone, just kind of make that kind of stark contrast look a little bit more. Might even bring the color down a little bit. It just feels like it's very harsh. And next thing I might bring down, see if we can bring down just the, maybe a little too much, but I like there. Now that negative 1/3 EV, this actually looks a lot closer to the actual Redscale shot of this scene. So again, our original here, I think there's just too much light and it's up here kind of distracting the scene versus what we had done. So let's look at the Grain Belt beer sign and the bridge, Hennepin Avenue Bridge, Asti at night. You know, that's one of the things I like about the film simulations is sometimes you can just pull colors in a different direction versus this scene just has a lot of variation of color versus I want to bring it into one look. That's why I say, for example, if I go back to my T64, you know, I just have a really just kind of couple main colors here versus the Redscale look is like kind of the complete opposite here. It's mostly yellows and reds and oranges. And again, I think this is a good base start to the look, but I would probably bring up, see if the shadows bring in some more contrast. Might see if bringing down the color more, or see what it does, bring way up the color. See, I think it's a little too red, but if you really like that look, you might want to go with it. So then you have that look, we can bring down the exposure a little bit. Now that's a different look that you could go for. It's not the look that I was originally intending, but now this has, you have less focus on the sky and so much more focus on the sign and the reflections. Here's the gold medal flower shot, kind of the original look of the scene. And I'll show you a little bit of my Cine Still look as well as the Fujichrome. Fujichrome's one of my favorites because it's mostly blue, but you really get the reds to pop. The Redscale is very red. Bringing up the shadow tone, make it more contrasty, and a little too much exposure. Yeah, maybe a third down. This has a nice look to it. As you've seen, I really liked this shot and all. I think it was kind of a hazy day or a very cloudy day, so a lot of reflections happening from the lights in the city bouncing off of the clouds that night. But again, here's kind of how it normally looks. I just feel like it just makes it not very dynamic of a scene. But if we go to either the other end of the spectrum, my blue look versus red look, just these windows just start to look a little eerie and kind of like it's a spooky house or something. But here we can again play with, if we want more shadow tone, I kind of like that, and bring down the exposure. You kind of start to see a little bit more of the sky, but I think that ends up being too much. So I actually liked the exposure right where it was at, but even playing with bringing the shadow tone up a little bit more kind of adds a new element of contrasting the darkness and the light in the scene. And the last shot I'll look at for night is I found there's this like stair steps that has these really cool lights, and tried to kind of get that in the shot in with this building. You know, here's the original shot at night, and that's one really cool thing to think about Redscale is like lights that are very white then turn into kind of this orange kind of look. Again, I'll do a quick contrast with the T64 blues. I think this has a really nice look to it too. But then back to Redscale, like, I don't know, these lights and all the lights within the condo building look so cool to me. Again, see, once you bring the shadow tones, it just kind of makes this image not as compelling. But when you have it at 2, maybe even all the way to 4, you know, kind of has this like Gotham City look to it. Play around with the exposures. I think it was pretty well exposed. I would love to see if you take this recipe and make any shots and come back with some of your own Redscale at night shots or during the day, and seeing if you can achieve a similar or really cool or new and interesting looks from it. Hey, so thank you so much for watching my video. I'm slowly starting to make more Fuji recipes. Now, I still do prefer film photography for my photo work, and most of this channel will be dedicated to that. But I do like the Fuji recipes, especially for video. But at times, I think it's good to have like different options and really show the inspiration of finding new ways to use color and white balance and film simulations in your work. If you're interested in this type of video, I have made a couple of Fujifilm recipe videos so far, with my favorite being the tungsten film recipes from my favorite film stocks shot at night. So go ahead and check that out if you like, and thanks for watching.